You are no longer mistress of Brackenmere. The Duke of Ashbourne placed his wife's estate key into Sir Oswald Crane's open palm before the entire household. For one suspended moment, Duchess Eleanor heard nothing, not the fire snapping in the great hearth, not the nervous breathing of the servants arranged along the walls, not even the winter wind pressing against the tall windows. She saw only the small iron key resting between Crane's pale fingers. Her mother had placed it in Eleanor's hand on her 18th birthday. "Land remembers who cares for it," she had said. "Make certain the people remember too." Now Eleanor's husband had surrendered it as casually as a gaming token. Sir Oswald examined the key with a satisfied smile. His silver waistcoat strained across his stomach, and the black ribbon securing his spectacles hung like a noose against his chest. "Brackenmere will be managed properly from this day forward," he announced. "Its unproductive cottages will be cleared, the northern farms consolidated, and the common fields enclosed before spring planting." A murmur moved through the servants. Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, gripped the edge of her apron. Two footmen exchanged horrified glances. Eleanor looked at her husband. Julian stood beside the carved mantel in his formal blue coat, one hand resting near the ducal signet at his waist. He was as composed as he had been at their wedding 9 years earlier, when he had promised to protect everything she brought into their marriage. "What have you done?" she asked. His expression hardened, though a faint pulse moved in his jaw. "I have prevented your mismanagement from ruining this family. Brackenmere's revenues have increased every year since I took control. Because you concealed your expenses, I repaired irrigation channels, restored tenant cottages, and purchased seed after the northern blight. Every expenditure is recorded. In books no one but you understands." Sir Oswald gave a quiet laugh. Eleanor turned toward him. "You will find them remarkably easy to understand when you discover how much profit those improvements created. You misunderstand your position, Your Grace." Crane slipped the key into his waistcoat pocket. "Your records are no longer your concern." Eleanor's gaze returned to Julian. "You sold my mother's estate. I exchanged an inefficient property for something that will protect Ashbourne's future." The wording was too polished, practiced. "What did he promise you?" Silence tightened across the great hall. Julian glanced at the watching servants, and humiliation flashed across his face. Not because he had betrayed her, Eleanor realized, but because she had forced him to name the price publicly. "At the end of this month," he said, "the Crown will appoint a Northern Commissioner." Sir Oswald possesses considerable influence with the ministry. Understanding struck with such force that Eleanor nearly stepped backward. "You traded 300 families for an office. I traded failing land for political authority." "Failing?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Brackenmere paid nearly 1/3 of Ashbourne's debts last year." A servant dropped a silver tray. The crash echoed through the hall. Julian's eyes flicked toward the young maid responsible. "Leave us." No one moved. "Everyone out." The servants began filing through the side doors, but slowly, their silence more condemning than any protest. Mrs. Hale paused beside Eleanor. "Your Grace," she whispered. "Men arrived from the village at dawn. They were measuring the cottages." Eleanor looked at Crane. He did not deny it. "What are you planning?" "Necessary improvements," he replied. "The eastern cottages stand upon excellent grazing land. Most will be removed." "How many?" 42 initially. 42 cottages meant nearly 200 people. "You cannot clear them in winter. I can clear my own property whenever I please. It is not yours." Crane patted the pocket containing her key. "The deed suggests otherwise." Eleanor turned on Julian. "You knew." Her husband's silence answered her. She remembered their conversation 3 weeks earlier, when he had asked how quickly the tenants could relocate if a military road crossed the estate. She had believed he was considering a crown proposal. She had shown him maps, explained the leases, and identified which families possessed lifelong tenancies. He had not been seeking to protect them. He had been calculating how difficult they would be to remove. "You could have refused him," she said quietly. For the first time, something uncertain entered Julian's eyes. Then pride extinguished it. "You have always mistaken sentiment for judgment. Go upstairs, Eleanor. Your allowance will continue if you cause no further embarrassment." My allowance? Your accounts are frozen until the transfer is complete. The final cruelty was delivered without anger. That made it worse. Eleanor had used her personal funds to buy grain, repair roofs, and train tenant farmers in crop rotation. Julian had praised her when the profits entered Ashbourne's treasury. Now he had stripped away her authority and intended to describe her work as reckless extravagance. She reached into her pocket and removed the ring of household keys. One by one, she laid them upon the long oak table, the wine cellar, the linen rooms, the medicine cupboard, the estate office. The last was a slender brass key Crane had clearly overlooked. Julian watched it strike the wood. What is that? Nothing that belongs to you. She closed her fingers around it before he could see its unusual teeth. It opened the iron compartment beneath her mother's writing desk, the compartment containing old surveys, private correspondence, and the original field journal Eleanor had never permitted anyone else to touch. She walked from the hall without requesting permission. Eleanor. Julian's voice followed her into the corridor. She stopped but did not turn. If you encourage resistance, he warned, any violence that follows will be your responsibility. No, Julian. Whatever follows began when you put that key in his hand. Upstairs, Eleanor retrieved the leather-bound journal, a cloak, and the small amount of money she kept inside her sewing box. When she descended by the servants' staircase, Mrs. Hale was waiting with a pair of sturdy boots. Crane's officers are already posting notices, the housekeeper said. The tenants must leave within 7 days. 7 days? He intends to bring demolition crews next Monday. Eleanor changed her shoes without another word and left through the kitchen courtyard. The road to Brackenmere was already marked with red papers nailed to trees and gateposts. She tore one down as she passed. All leases terminated by order of the legal proprietor. Below the printed notice, someone had added a list of penalties for obstruction, seizure of livestock, imprisonment, and removal by armed officers. Eleanor folded the paper and placed it inside her mother's journal. By the time she reached the hill above the village, darkness had begun swallowing the fields. Lanterns flickered below like a line of grounded stars. Then she saw the barricade. Plows, wagons, stones, and felled branches had been dragged across the main gates. Hundreds of tenants stood behind them, farmers, laborers, widows, and children. No one carried a weapon, yet no one appeared willing to move. Old Thomas Bell stepped forward as Eleanor approached. "Your Grace," he said, removing his cap, "we heard what the Duke did. I will not ask you to risk prison for my sake. It isn't only for you." He looked toward the cottages where generations of the same families had been born. Before Eleanor could answer, a frightened young man pushed through the crowd. She recognized him as a junior clerk from Ashbourne's solicitor's office. His coat was torn, and blood darkened one cuff. "Your Grace, I had to come before Crane discovered I copied it." He pressed a folded page into her hand. At the bottom stood Julian's unmistakable signature. Above it was a confession of debt so enormous that Eleanor read the amount twice, unable to believe it. Ashbourne was not merely in difficulty. The dukedom was weeks from financial collapse. A final clause stated that if payment was not delivered before Parliament convened, Sir Oswald Crane would gain the right to seize every unentailed Ashbourne property, not only Brackenmere. Eleanor lifted her gaze to the trembling clerk. "When does Parliament convene?" His face went white. "In 48 hours. In 48 hours. The clerk's answer seemed to move through the crowd like a freezing wind. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the document again. Julian had acknowledged a debt of £80,000, an amount no ordinary extravagance could explain. Even the grandest Ashbourne properties could not satisfy it without dismantling the dukedom piece by piece. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In Mr. Pembroke's locked cabinet." The clerk glanced anxiously toward the road. "Sir Oswald ordered every duplicate burned after the transfer was signed. I copied this page before he arrived. What is your name?" "Samuel Reed, Your Grace." "Why risk your position for me, Mr. Reed?" His mouth tightened. "My parents live in the eastern cottages." That simple answer carried more weight than any pledge of loyalty. Eleanor examined the page beneath Thomas Bell's lantern. The signature looked authentic. Julian's long downward stroke cut through the final letter exactly as it did on every estate order. Yet something troubled her. "The agreement refers to a prior obligation," she said. "Where is the original loan? I never saw it. Mr. Pembroke said it was held privately." "By Crane?" Samuel shook his head. "By the Bellwether Company." Eleanor had never heard the name. "Who owns it?" "No one at the solicitor's office knows. Payments were made through 3 separate banks. Sir Oswald presented himself as the company's authorized collector only 6 weeks ago." Thomas Bell muttered a curse. Around him, several farmers began demanding explanations. Eleanor raised her hand. "We will discover where the debt came from. Until then, no one attacks Crane's men, no matter how they provoke you." "And if they come through the gates?" a young tenant called. "Sit in the road. Bring witnesses. Make them drag unarmed mothers and children through the mud if they wish to claim lawful conduct." A grim murmur of approval moved through the villagers. Eleanor turned to Thomas. "Organize watches at all 3 entrances. No guns, no knives, and no drink. Write down the names of every officer who threatens anyone. You believe records will stop them? No, but records will prevent them from rewriting what happens afterward." The field journal beneath her arm suddenly felt heavier. Her mother had taught her that land disputes were rarely won by the loudest claimant. They were won by the person who preserved the oldest boundary map, remembered the forgotten lease, or found the signature everyone else had overlooked. Eleanor opened the journal to the final pages. Hand-drawn drainage lines crossed each field in fading brown ink. Tenant agreements were recorded in the margins, along with crop yields and repairs. Near the eastern cottages, her mother had written a single sentence: "These homes are protected independently of the estate." Originals secured beneath the old mill. Eleanor stared at the words. She had studied that page many times, yet never understood the reference. The mill had been abandoned since a fire damaged its wheel 12 years earlier. "Thomas, did my mother ever store documents at the old mill?" The farmer frowned. "Not that I remember, but Mr. Bellamy worked there before the fire. Is he still alive?" "He is, though he rarely leaves his cottage." Eleanor looked toward the village. "Take me to him." They had gone only a few steps when hoofbeats sounded beyond the barricade. Lanterns swung toward the road. 6 mounted officers appeared first, followed by a dark carriage bearing Sir Oswald Crane's crest. The riders stopped before the locked gates. One carried a short musket across his saddle. Crane descended with Julian beside him. Eleanor felt the villagers' anger sharpen. Her husband had not come to prevent violence. He had brought it to their door. Julian surveyed the barricade, then found Eleanor among the tenants. His expression changed, not with surprise, but with the cold disappointment of a man who believed his authority had been deliberately insulted. "You gave me your word that you would not encourage disorder," he called. "I gave you no such word. You were warned, and they were given 7 days to abandon homes protected by lifelong leases." Crane approached the bars. "Those leases were terminated with the transfer. Some cannot be terminated by a sale. You no longer possess the authority to interpret them." "I can still read." A few tenants laughed. Crane's cheeks darkened. Julian dismounted and walked closer. "Open the gate, Eleanor." "No." His eyes narrowed. "You are placing these people in danger. You brought armed men. They are here because you created a rebellion. This is not rebellion. It is refusal." Julian lowered his voice, though everyone nearest the gate could still hear him. "Come back to Ashbourne House. We can resolve this privately." "You made the betrayal public." For a heartbeat, pain crossed his face. It vanished so quickly Eleanor might once have mistaken it for remorse. Then Crane leaned toward him and whispered something. Julian looked past Eleanor at Samuel Reed. The clerk froze. "That man stole confidential documents," Julian announced. "Seize him." One officer dismounted and reached for the chain. The villagers closed ranks around Samuel. Eleanor stepped between them and the gate. "On whose complaint?" "Mine," Crane replied. "What did he steal?" "Private financial papers." "Then describe them." Crane hesitated. Eleanor removed the copied page from her journal. "Perhaps you mean this. The agreement stating that the Duke of Ashbourne owes £80,000 to a company no one can identify." Shock erupted behind her. Julian's face drained of color. Where did you get that? It was not the question of an innocent man. Eleanor held his gaze. Did you borrow the money? That is not a matter to discuss before tenants. Did you sign the confession of debt? I signed documents necessary to preserve this family. Crane gripped the gate. That page is stolen and therefore inadmissible. An accurate copy does not become false because you dislike the hands holding it. It proves only that His Grace honored a legitimate obligation. Then produce the original loan agreement before Parliament convenes. For the first time, Crane's confidence faltered. Only slightly, but Eleanor saw it. Crane had expected her to weep, retreat, or appeal to Julian's affection. He had not expected her to examine the debt itself. Julian stepped closer to the bars. Give me the paper. No, Eleanor, you do not understand what you are interfering with. Then explain it. His silence was answer enough. Crane signaled to the mounted officers. Break the chain. One rider lifted a heavy iron tool from his saddle. Thomas Bell and the other farmers braced themselves behind the barricade. Women pulled the children toward the cottages. Samuel seized Eleanor's sleeve. Your Grace, there is something else, he whispered urgently. The debt was not recorded 8 years ago. The officer struck the chain. Metal rang through the darkness. What do you mean? Eleanor asked. Samuel's voice trembled. The document claims the Duke borrowed the money before your marriage. Another blow shook the gate. But the paper bears a watermark, Samuel continued. It came from a mill that began operating only 3 years ago. The chain snapped. The gate swung inward, and Sir Oswald Crane smiled. The broken chain fell into the mud. Crane's officers pushed the gates apart, but the villagers remained seated across the road. Mothers held children against their skirts. Old men linked arms with farm laborers. No one raised a weapon. The mounted officer hesitated. Move them, Crane ordered. With what authority? Eleanor demanded. Crane unfolded the deed. This property is mine. Then proceed carefully. 200 witnesses are watching. His gaze settled on Samuel. Arrest the thief first. The officer advanced, but Eleanor stepped in front of the clerk. You will not touch him without a magistrate's warrant. Crane turned to Julian. Control your wife. Julian's expression tightened. Eleanor, stand aside. Instead, she gave him Samuel's revelation. The debt agreement claims you borrowed £80,000 before our marriage. Yet the paper was manufactured only 3 years ago. Julian stared at her. That is impossible. Did you read the original before signing your confession? His silence chilled her. Crane spoke quickly. The Duke's earlier obligation was recopied after the original suffered water damage. Where is the damaged document? Destroyed. And the witnesses? Dead. How convenient. Crane moved closer. You are attempting to confuse an ordinary legal transfer because you cannot accept losing control. No. I am asking why my husband confessed to a debt he never verified. Julian's face hardened at the public rebuke. Sir Oswald showed me my father's private accounts. Accounts you recognized. They bore his seal. A seal can be copied. I know my own family's mark, and I knew my mother's land, yet you sold it without asking me. The words struck him. For a moment, Eleanor saw the man who had once ridden beside her through these fields, listening as she explained how drainage could rescue the ruined farms. Then Crane broke the silence. Remove the villagers. The officer reached for Thomas Bell. A chapel bell rang across Brackenmere. Once. Twice. By the 5th toll, every tenant had turned toward the village. 13 slow notes rolled over the dark fields. Thomas crossed himself. What does it mean? Samuel whispered. Eleanor remembered another line in her mother's journal. It is a warning of unlawful seizure. Crane's confidence vanished. Who rang it? From beyond the cottages, a boy came running. Mr. Bellamy, he shouted. He found something beneath the old mill. Eleanor started toward him, but Crane seized her wrist. You will remain here. Julian stepped forward. Release her. Crane's grip loosened, though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor. You have no idea what you are disturbing, he said. That is the second time I have heard those words tonight. She pulled free and walked toward the village. Thomas, Samuel, and several tenants followed. Behind them, Crane spoke urgently to Julian. Eleanor could not hear every word, but she caught one phrase. The appointment will disappear. So that was how Crane controlled him. Julian had not merely hoped for political advancement. He had staked his reputation upon it, and Crane knew his ambition mattered more to him than doubt, loyalty, or his wife. The old mill stood beside a narrow stream. Its roof had collapsed years earlier, leaving blackened beams exposed to the sky. Mr. Bellamy waited inside with a lantern. He was thin, bent, and nearly blind in one eye. Your mother made me swear not to open the compartment unless someone tried to seize the eastern cottages, he told Eleanor. He pointed toward a stone beneath the ruined grinding wheel. Thomas and 2 farmers lifted it. Beneath lay an iron box covered in soot. Eleanor took the brass key from her pocket. It fitted perfectly. Inside were bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth. She opened the first and recognized her mother's handwriting. The eastern cottages had not been included in Eleanor's inheritance. 12 years earlier, her mother had placed them in a charitable trust for the permanent use of the tenant families. Crane could not demolish them. A second document contained the signatures of 2 trustees. One was Mr. Bellamy. The other made Eleanor's breath catch. Julian's father, she whispered. The late Duke of Ashbourne had helped establish the trust, the same man whose alleged debt Crane was using to seize Brackenmere. Something slid from between the documents and landed at Eleanor's feet, a sealed letter addressed to Julian. Before she could lift it, glass shattered behind her. A burning bottle struck the mill floor. Flames rushed across the dry timber. "Get the documents out," Eleanor cried. Thomas seized the box while Samuel dragged Mr. Bellamy toward the doorway. Smoke thickened instantly. Eleanor grabbed the sealed letter, but a burning beam crashed across her path. Through the flames, she saw a man fleeing toward the trees. He wore the blue coat of an Ashbourne officer. Then a gunshot cracked outside. Samuel staggered at the doorway and fell, still clutching the iron box. Samuel fell against the doorway, the iron box trapped beneath him. Eleanor rushed through the smoke and dropped beside him. Blood spread across his upper arm, but he was conscious. "The bullet passed through," she said. "Thomas, get him away from the fire." 2 farmers carried Samuel toward the stream, while Eleanor pulled the iron box free. Above her, burning beams groaned. "Your Grace," Mr. Bellamy shouted. Eleanor seized the box and ran outside moments before the mill roof collapsed. Sparks exploded into the night. Julian and Crane arrived with the officers. Crane stared at the rescued box, his face tightening. "What happened?" Julian demanded. "One of your officers threw a burning bottle," Eleanor said. "Another shot Samuel." Julian turned sharply. "Which officer?" "The man wore your colors." Crane stepped between them. In smoke and darkness, Her Grace could have seen anyone. "I saw the blue coat." "All my men are accounted for." Eleanor counted the officers. 5 stood near the stream. 6 had entered Brackenmere. "1 is missing." Crane glanced toward them. Hawkins rode back for assistance. "Before or after setting the mill on fire?" Julian looked at Crane. "Bring him back." "Your Grace, this is hardly the moment." "Bring him back." For the first time, Crane obeyed reluctantly. Eleanor knelt beside Samuel. Thomas had wrapped his arm, but the clerk's lips had gone pale. "The documents," he whispered. "Safe. Then take them to London. Crane has men at every local court." Julian approached. "Let me see them." Eleanor rose, holding the box against her chest. "No. My father's signature is on those papers, and mine was removed from the deed you signed. This concerns Ashbourne. It concerned Ashbourne when you sold my inheritance." He flinched, but his voice remained controlled. "If the debt was forged, I was deceived too. You had the power to question it. You chose not to. Because Crane showed me proof. He showed you an office." Julian looked toward the wounded clerk and the burning mill. For once he had no answer. Mr. Bellamy came closer, coughing into a cloth. "The late Duke distrusted Sir Oswald," he said. "He believed Crane was purchasing debts from desperate noble families." Julian frowned. "My father never mentioned him." "He did more than mention him." Bellamy pointed to the sealed letter in Eleanor's hand. Julian recognized the writing immediately. "That is addressed to me." "Yes," Eleanor said. and it remained hidden because you helped trigger the condition under which it could be found. She broke the seal. The first lines were affectionate, written by a father who knew he might not live long enough to guide his son. Then the tone changed. Julian, if anyone presents a private debt bearing my seal, compare it against the enclosed register. I discovered that impressions were taken from my signet while it was being repaired. No obligation is valid unless recorded in my own hand. Eleanor searched the box and found a narrow ledger. Julian took one involuntary step forward. She opened it. Each genuine loan carried a date, creditor, purpose, and repayment record. There was no £80,000 debt. Crane's entire claim rested upon a forgery. Julian read the page over her shoulder. His face became rigid. He showed me letters from my father. Then those were likely forged too. No. Julian shook his head. I recognized the private details. Details someone close to your father could have known. Mr. Bellamy lowered his gaze. Julian noticed. What are you hiding? The old man hesitated. Your father dismissed his secretary shortly before his death. The man was accused of selling private information. Name him. Edmund Vale. Eleanor knew the name. Vale now served as chief clerk of the ministry responsible for selecting the Northern Commissioner. Crane had offered Julian an appointment controlled by the same man who could authenticate the forged debt. The trap was larger than Brackenmere. Julian seemed to understand it at the same moment. Crane never intended to secure my appointment. No, Eleanor said. He intended to make you dependent upon the promise. Hoofbeats sounded along the road. Everyone turned, expecting Crane's missing officer. Instead, 3 constables entered the village, accompanied by the county magistrate. Crane rode behind them. He pointed directly at Eleanor. There she is. Arrest the Duchess of Ashbourne for inciting a riot, stealing legal documents, and attempting to burn property that no longer belongs to her. Julian stepped forward. That accusation is false. Crane smiled without warmth. Then you may explain to the magistrate why the arsonist has just sworn that your wife paid him. Behind Crane sat the missing officer, Hawkins. His blue coat was stained with soot, and in his hand he held Eleanor's embroidered purse. Eleanor recognized the purse immediately. Blue silk, silver clasp, her initials embroidered beneath the Ashbourne crest. It had been inside her writing desk that morning. Hawkins held it up for the magistrate to see. The Duchess gave me 10 guineas and ordered me to burn the mill. She said the fire would destroy evidence that the eastern cottages belonged to Sir Oswald. Crane opened the purse and poured several gold coins into his palm. A murmur of disbelief spread through the villagers. Eleanor studied Hawkins. Soot marked his sleeves, but the cuff of his right glove was clean. The man who had thrown the bottle had used that hand. Either Hawkins had changed his glove, or he had never thrown it. You claim I hired you, she said. When? This afternoon at Ashbourne House. Where? In the west drawing room. There were 6 servants cleaning that room all afternoon. Hawkins hesitated. Then it was the library, which has been locked since Julian dismissed me from the estate council. The magistrate frowned. Crane stepped in quickly. A frightened man may confuse the precise room. But not the woman who paid him? Eleanor asked. Hawkins looked toward Crane before answering. I know what I saw. Julian noticed the glance. So do I, he said coldly. You were stationed outside the great hall from noon until we departed. When could Eleanor have met you privately? Hawkins's confidence faltered. Crane addressed the magistrate. His Grace is naturally reluctant to see his wife arrested, but the purse was found in Hawkins's saddlebag, along with written instructions. He produced a folded note. The magistrate read it aloud. Burn the mill after the documents are removed. If Reed interferes, silence him. The message bore Eleanor's signature. Julian took the note and stared at it. Eleanor saw uncertainty cross his face. He had accepted one forged document because it offered him power. Would he accept another because it protected him from guilt? He looked at her. Did you write this? The question wounded more deeply than she expected. After everything we discovered tonight, you still ask me that? I need an answer. No, Julian. Crane gave a weary sigh. Every accused person denies the charge. Eleanor turned to the magistrate. Compare the note with the entry in my field journal. She opened the journal, and held both pages beneath a lantern. "The capital E is similar," the magistrate observed. "Look at the ink." He leaned closer. Eleanor pointed to the note. "This is iron gall ink mixed recently. It remains black before fading toward brown. My journal entry was written tonight with the small bottle I carry." The magistrate examined the writing. "They appear identical." "Exactly. Yet my ink bottle shattered inside the mill before Hawkins returned. Whoever wrote that note used ink taken from my room or my desk." Crane's mouth tightened. Eleanor reached for the purse, but he withdrew it. "Do not touch evidence." "Then open the inner pocket." The magistrate took the purse and found the concealed compartment. He pulled out a tiny paper packet. "What is this?" "Lavender seeds," Eleanor replied. "My mother placed them there before my wedding. I have never removed them." He opened the packet. It was empty. Eleanor faced Hawkins. "The person who stole my purse did not know about the seeds." "Seeds prove nothing," Crane snapped. "They prove the purse was opened and searched. Someone removed its personal contents before filling it with coins." Julian's expression darkened. "Who had access to Eleanor's rooms?" Crane remained silent. Mrs. Hale's voice came from behind the villagers. "Sir Oswald did." Everyone turned. The housekeeper walked toward the magistrate, accompanied by a young maid. "This is Mary Collins," she said. "She saw Sir Oswald leave her Grace's private corridor after the household was dismissed." Mary trembled but raised her chin. "He carried something blue beneath his coat." Crane's face hardened. "A servant's invention." "I saw the silver clasp," Mary insisted. Crane stepped toward her. Julian blocked his path. "Do not approach the witness." The magistrate looked between them. "Until these accusations are examined, I will take possession of the purse, the note, and the documents." "No," Eleanor said. His eyebrows rose. "Your Grace? The documents from the mill establish a charitable trust. If you take the originals, Crane may challenge their existence before we reach London." "Are you accusing me of dishonesty?" "I am refusing to place the only surviving proof in the hands of any man whose loyalties I have not verified." The constable stiffened. Julian spoke quietly. "She is right." The magistrate's face reddened. "You forget yourself, Ashbourne." "No, I forgot myself when I signed a confession without examining the debt." Crane's voice sharpened. "If you withdraw your support now, Vale will ensure you never receive another crown appointment." Julian stared at him. There it was, the threat spoken openly before witnesses. Eleanor watched her husband confront the true price of his ambition. He could still retreat, pretend Crane's conduct was unrelated to their agreement, and preserve his political hopes. Instead, Julian removed the ducal signet from his waist. "I formally revoke every authority I granted Sir Oswald Crane." Crane laughed. "Too late. The transfer is complete." "Then I will testify that it was obtained through fraud." "You signed willingly." "Yes," Julian said, "and I will answer for that." It was not an apology. It did not restore Eleanor's estate or erase the danger he had created. But it was the first time he had chosen truth when pride offered him an escape. Crane looked toward Hawkins. The officer suddenly drew a pistol. Before anyone could stop him, Hawkins seized Mary and pressed the barrel beneath her chin. "Put down the iron box," he ordered Eleanor, "or the girl dies." The villagers froze. Eleanor carefully lowered the box. Hawkins dragged Mary backward toward Crane's carriage. Crane did not appear surprised. Thomas Bell shifted beside Eleanor, but she caught his sleeve. "Wait." Her gaze moved to the road behind the carriage. The recent rain had turned it into deep mud. Crane's driver had left the wheels angled toward the drainage ditch Eleanor designed years earlier. If the carriage moved quickly, its rear axle would sink. Eleanor lifted both hands. "Take the box," she said. Hawkins smiled and loosened his hold on Mary just enough to reach for it. "Now," Eleanor shouted. Mary dropped to the ground. Thomas struck Hawkins's wrist with his walking stick. The pistol fired into the air. Julian lunged, driving the officer against the carriage door. Crane climbed inside and ordered the driver forward. The horses surged. As Eleanor predicted, the rear wheel slid into the concealed ditch. The carriage tipped violently, throwing Crane against the window. The villagers surrounded it, but when the constables pulled the door open, Sir Oswald was gone. A false panel stood open behind the rear seat, revealing a narrow exit. Inside lay a leather case filled with ministry correspondence. Eleanor opened it. The first letter bore Edmund Vale's signature. It ordered Crane to deliver the Brackenmere deed and the forged debt to London before Parliament convened. The second contained a list of 12 noble estates. Every one of them had been seized by the Bellwether Company. At the bottom of the list, beside Ashbourne, someone had written, "Final property acquired. Begin the northern removals immediately." Eleanor looked beyond the carriage toward Brackenmere's distant fields. Crane had not wanted the estate merely for profit. He needed its location, and whatever the northern removals meant would begin before dawn. Eleanor spread Crane's map across the overturned carriage door. The 12 seized estates formed a crooked line across the northern counties. Brackenmere sat at its center, where 2 rivers and the King's Military Road converged. "This is not about sheep fields," she said. "Crane has been buying an entire transport route." Julian studied the marked properties. "For what purpose?" Samuel, pale but still conscious, pointed to a symbol beside each estate. "Those marks appear in Bellwether's payment books. I thought they identified banks." "They identify granaries," Eleanor said. Her mother's journal contained the same symbol beside every major grain store. Brackenmere's restored granary was the largest within 50 miles. She opened Vale's letter again. "Begin the northern removals immediately. They intend to remove the grain," she realized. Thomas looked toward the village. "But the winter reserve feeds 5 counties." "Exactly. Once it disappears, prices will rise." Julian's face hardened. "Bellwether owns grain merchants." 3 of them, Samuel confirmed. "They have been buying failed farms for months." Crane's plan became clear. His company would control the roads, empty the reserves, create an artificial shortage, and then sell grain back at ruinous prices. Families unable to pay would surrender their land. Brackenmere was not the final prize. It was the final lock on a trap built around half the north. Eleanor turned to Thomas. "How many wagons are in the northern fields?" 20 arrived yesterday. Crane claimed they carried fencing. They are here for the granary." In the distance, a horn sounded. Then came the rumble of wheels. "They have already begun," Eleanor said. The villagers raced toward the northern storehouses. Julian ordered the constables to follow, but the magistrate raised a hand. "Sir Oswald holds the deed. Until fraud is established, removing grain from his property may be lawful." "The grain belongs to the tenant reserve," Eleanor replied. "Can you prove it?" "The records are at Ashbourne House." Julian's expression darkened. "Crane controls the estate office, and Vale's men may already be destroying it." Eleanor made her decision. "Thomas, delay the wagons without violence. Samuel, stay with Mr. Bellamy and protect the trust documents. Julian, come with me." He looked almost surprised that she had included him. "We need the reserve ledgers," she continued. "They bear every tenant's contribution. Without them, Crane will call the grain his own." They rode hard toward Ashbourne House. Neither spoke until the manor appeared beyond the trees. Then Julian said, "I believed Crane because my father died owing debts he never explained." "You believed him because he offered you what you wanted. I thought the commission would restore Ashbourne's influence, at the cost of Brackenmere." He gripped the reins. "I was wrong." "Yes." Her answer contained no comfort. At the manor, the front doors stood open. Papers littered the entrance hall, and smoke drifted from the estate office. Eleanor ran inside. 2 masked men were feeding ledgers into the fireplace. Julian tackled one, while Eleanor seized a brass poker and struck the other's wrist. The man fled through the window, leaving blood on the broken glass. The first struggled beneath Julian. "Who sent you?" Julian demanded. The man bit down sharply. A moment later, his body went limp. Eleanor knelt beside him and smelled bitter almonds. "Poison," she said. He chose death over answering. They pulled the remaining ledgers from the flames. Several were ruined, but the Winter Reserve book had survived. Eleanor opened it. Each tenant's contribution was recorded, but across the final page, a newer entry had been added. Entire reserve transferred to Bellwether Company by authority of the Duchess of Ashbourne. Below it appeared Eleanor's signature. Julian stared at the page. Another forgery. A more dangerous one. This ledger is the official record. A sound came from behind the bookcase. Julian drew his pistol. Eleanor pressed the carved panel her mother had once shown her, revealing a narrow cupboard. Mrs. Hale stepped out with Mary. The maid clutched a stack of folded papers. "We hid when the men entered," the housekeeper said. "Mary saved these from Mr. Pembroke's desk." They were payment orders from Bellwether to Ashbourne's steward, Mr. Pembroke. He had been altering Eleanor's accounts for 3 years, changing agricultural investments into unexplained losses, hiding Brackenmere's profits, and making Julian believe the estate was failing. One payment was dated that morning. Beside it appeared an instruction: deliver Lady Ashbourne's reserve ledger to Vale at Parliament. Her signature will validate the removal. Eleanor understood. They would not merely take the grain, they would accuse her of selling it. A gunshot echoed from the courtyard. The surviving masked intruder stood beside a waiting horse, holding a burning torch. He hurled it through the estate office window. Flames leaped across the scattered papers. Julian pushed Eleanor toward the corridor as the curtains ignited. "The ledger," she cried. He reached through the flames and seized it, burning his hand. Together they escaped while servants formed a water line. Outside, a stable boy came running from the northern road. "Your Grace." Crane's wagons reached the granary. The farmers blocked them, but soldiers arrived with orders from the ministry. "How many?" Eleanor asked. "Nearly 100. Julian looked at the Bellwether correspondence. "Vale commands no soldiers." "Not legally," Eleanor said. The boy shook his head desperately. "They have cannon, Your Grace. They say if the gates are not opened by midnight, they will fire upon the village." The manor clock began striking 11. Eleanor had 1 hour to stop a massacre, and the evidence that could save Brackenmere was burning in her husband's hands. By the time Eleanor reached Brackenmere's northern granary, the soldiers had positioned 2 small cannons opposite the gates. The villagers stood behind their wagons. Crane's men waited beside 20 empty grain carts. A uniformed captain stepped forward. "By ministerial authority, the reserve will be transferred immediately." "Show me the order," Eleanor said. He handed her a document bearing the ministry seal and Edmund Vale's signature. It declared the grain crown property needed for military use. "The army does not collect grain in private wagons," Eleanor said. The captain looked toward Crane's carts. Doubt flickered across his face. Julian opened Vale's recovered case. These letters prove Bellwether arranged the removal before any military order existed. Those papers could be stolen. They were found inside Sir Oswald Crane's carriage before the county magistrate and dozens of witnesses. The captain hesitated, but a rider emerged from behind the wagons. "Crane, do not be deceived," he called. "The Duchess forged those letters after selling the reserve herself." He held up the altered ledger page bearing Eleanor's signature. "This proves she transferred the grain to Bellwether. Now she intends to blame others before the shortage is discovered." Angry murmurs rose among the soldiers. Eleanor walked toward the gate. "That page is false. It is recorded in your own ledger." "Then let us inspect the granary." Crane's expression changed. "There is no need. There is every need. If I sold the reserve 3 months ago, as your entry claims, these stores should contain Bellwether sacks." She turned to the captain. "My tenants mark every contribution with a green thread tied beneath the seam. Open any sack. If the thread is present, the grain still belongs to them." The captain ordered a soldier to examine one. A green thread appeared, then another, and another. Crane reached for his pistol, but Julian drew first. "Do not." The captain faced Crane. "You presented false information to armed forces." "The ledger is lawful," Crane insisted. The threads could have been added later. A church clock began chiming midnight. At the final stroke, a flare rose from the western hill. The cannon crew moved. "Stop," Eleanor shouted. But the first cannon fired, not at the villagers, but over the granary roof. The explosion frightened the horses. Crane's wagon team bolted toward the open storehouse, crashing through the wooden barrier. Eleanor saw the plan immediately. They want the grain destroyed. Several wagons carried oil barrels beneath their canvas covers. One overturned inside the granary, spilling oil across the floor. A masked driver lit a torch. Julian fired, striking the torch from his hand. The villagers swarmed the wagons while soldiers dragged the oil barrels outside. Crane fled toward the river. Eleanor followed him through the narrow drainage fields she had designed years earlier. He did not know where the ground remained firm. His boot plunged into a concealed channel, and he fell. Before Eleanor reached him, he pulled a pistol. "You should have accepted your loss," he said. "You mistook patience for surrender." Crane aimed at her chest. Julian struck him from behind. The pistol fired into the mud. The two men struggled until Thomas and the captain arrived. Crane was dragged upright and bound. "You have nothing," Crane spat. "Vale controls the ministry records, the witnesses, and the parliamentary committee. By morning, your evidence will be called counterfeit." Eleanor looked toward the saved granary. "He may control paper," she said, "but not every estate you robbed." She opened the list of 12 properties. Each ruined family could testify to the same forged debts, the same hidden company, and the same method of seizure. The captain ordered Crane imprisoned in the village lockup until he could be transported to London. As the soldiers withdrew, Julian approached Eleanor. His burned hand was wrapped in torn cloth. "I will testify against Vale," he said, "and confess that you signed away Brackenmere willingly?" His gaze lowered. "Yes. You may lose your seat, your influence, and much of Ashbourne. I know." Eleanor studied him. Earlier that day, he had valued those things above her home. Now remorse had arrived only after the consequences threatened him too. "I needed you to question Crane before you gave him my key," she said, "not after he aimed a cannon at my people." Julian's face tightened with shame. A rider interrupted them, galloping into the yard with a sealed parliamentary summons. Eleanor broke it open. The committee would hear Bellwether's claim at 10 the next morning. If she failed to appear, the Brackenmere transfer would become permanent. London was 8 hours away under favorable conditions, and someone had cut the harnesses of every horse in the village. Eleanor looked at the ruined harnesses, then toward the river. "The grain barges," she said. Thomas understood immediately. Brackenmere's old canal joined the southern river 6 miles downstream, where a mail coach departed for London before dawn. "The lock gates have not been opened in years," Julian warned. "I rebuilt them." Within minutes, the tenants carried the iron box, Crane's correspondence, the reserve ledger, and the trust documents aboard a narrow grain barge. Samuel, too injured to travel, remained behind under the captain's protection. Eleanor stepped onto the deck. Julian followed. "You should stay and secure Crane," she said. "My testimony is part of the evidence. So is your confession." "I know." Thomas opened the first lock. Water surged beneath the vessel, carrying them into the darkness. For 3 hours they traveled by lantern light. Eleanor studied the recovered papers while Julian sat opposite her, his burned hand resting on his knee. "Pembroke altered my reports before giving them to you," she said, "but you never once asked me why the numbers differed. I believed you had become secretive. I stopped explaining because you had already decided every disagreement was defiance." Julian lowered his gaze. "Crane told me you intended to separate Brackenmere from Ashbourne, and you feared losing control." "Yes." The admission came without excuse. "Your mother's estate made you independent," he continued. "Each year, people praised your work while Ashbourne's influence declined. I told myself I was protecting the title. In truth, I resented needing what you had built." Eleanor closed the ledger. His honesty arrived late, but it named the wound accurately. Crane had manipulated Julian's pride. He had not created it. "At the Great Hall, you called my work mismanagement," she said. "I lied publicly to justify what I had done. Then any correction must also be public. It will be." Dawn was breaking when they reached the southern landing. The mail coach waited, but 4 armed men stood beside it. Edmund Vale's men had anticipated them. "Give us the box," their leader ordered. Eleanor whispered to Thomas, "Release the empty grain barrels." Thomas cut the rope securing them. The heavy barrels rolled down the sloping quay, scattering the men and frightening their horses. Julian pulled Eleanor toward the coach. They climbed inside as Thomas seized the driver's seat. A shot shattered the rear window. The pursuit continued for 5 miles until one attacker drew alongside the coach and reached through the broken glass. Eleanor slammed the iron box against his wrist. He fell from the saddle. The remaining men abandoned the chase when they reached the first London toll gate, where witnesses crowded the road. At 9:30, the coach stopped outside Parliament. Eleanor descended with mud on her hem, smoke in her hair, and the iron box locked beneath her arm. Julian followed, pale from exhaustion. The committee chamber was already full. Lords, ministers, reporters, and representatives of the seized estates occupied every bench. At the central table sat Edmund Vale. He was a narrow-faced man with silver hair and calm eyes. Beside him rested the original Brackenmere deed and the alleged debt bearing the late Duke's seal. Vale glanced at the clock. "You arrive with 20 minutes remaining, Duchess." "I arrive with evidence. You arrive accused of theft, arson, and unlawful obstruction." Whispers spread through the chamber. Eleanor placed the iron box on the table. Vale smiled faintly. "Before you open that, you should know Sir Oswald Crane has already submitted a sworn statement. Crane is under arrest for crimes you manufactured to discredit him." The chairman called the hearing to order. Vale presented the debt first, describing how the late Duke of Ashbourne had supposedly borrowed £80,000 and concealed it from his heir. Then he produced Eleanor's altered ledger. Faced with her husband's lawful sale, Vale announced, the Duchess incited tenants, destroyed property, and attempted to hide her own transfer of the grain reserve. Julian rose. "That statement is false." Vale's calm expression sharpened. "Your Grace, remember that your future position depends upon your credibility." Julian walked to the witness table. "I signed the Brackenmere transfer willingly," he said. "I did so without consulting my wife, without verifying the alleged debt, and because Mr. Vale's allies promised me political office." The chamber erupted. Eleanor watched him surrender the reputation he had betrayed her to obtain. The chairman demanded silence. Vale stood slowly. "A remorseful husband is not proof of forgery." "No," Eleanor said, "but this is." She opened the iron box and reached for the late Duke's private debt register. It was gone. In its place lay a folded note. "Thank you for carrying the remaining evidence to London." The box had been opened during their journey, and behind Eleanor, the committee doors locked from the outside. Eleanor stared into the iron box. The trust documents remained, but the late Duke's debt register and Vale's correspondence had vanished. Only 3 people had been near the box during the journey: Eleanor, Julian, and Thomas. Vale addressed the committee chairman. "Since the Duchess cannot produce her alleged proof, I request immediate confirmation of Bellwether's ownership." "Not yet," Eleanor said. She examined the lock. Its brass edge bore a thin smear of green wax. Thomas had sealed the box with brown candle wax at Brackenmere. The green wax belonged to the mail coach company. Someone had opened it after they reached the southern landing. "The coach stopped once before London," Eleanor said. "At the Red Lion toll house." Julian understood. The driver changed horses, and a guard climbed onto the rear platform. Vale's smile faded. Eleanor faced the reporters. "Send a messenger to the Red Lion." "Search the coach company strongbox." The chairman refused. "This committee will not delay proceedings based on speculation." Then pounding sounded outside the locked doors. "Open in the King's name." The doors burst inward. Royal officers entered with Thomas Bell and Samuel Reed behind them. Samuel's injured arm rested in a sling. In his good hand he carried the missing register. Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas smiled. "I suspected the box would be searched. We replaced the originals with copies at the landing." Samuel placed the register before the chairman. Beside it he laid Bellwether's payment books and the original account from the paper mill, confirming that the forged debt sheet had been manufactured 3 years earlier. Eleanor opened the late Duke's register. No debt to Bellwether appears here. His letter also confirms that an impression of his seal was stolen. Vale rose. "Fabrications. Then explain these." Representatives from the other 11 estates entered the chamber. Each carried a forged debt bearing an aristocratic seal. Each document used paper produced years after the date written upon it. The same handwriting appeared in the margins. Samuel identified it as Edmund Vales. Julian took the witness stand again. I gave Crane authority because I wanted political office. I ignored my wife's accounts, repeated false accusations against her, froze her money, and signed away her inheritance without her consent. Vale exploited my vanity, but the betrayal was mine. Silence filled the chamber. Eleanor had not expected him to name every wrong so plainly. The chairman ordered Vale's desk searched. Royal officers found 12 estate seals, blank ministry orders, and a ledger showing Bellwether had purchased grain warehouses before arranging the artificial shortage. Vale lunged for the fireplace with the ledger. Eleanor blocked him and seized it first. The evidence proved the entire scheme. Forged ancestral debts forced nobles to surrender key estates. Crane controlled transportation routes. Vale supplied legal authority. Pembroke falsified local accounts. And grain reserves would be removed to create famine prices. The chairman revoked Brackenmere's transfer and ordered Vale arrested, but Vale began laughing. "You saved one granary," he said as officers bound his wrists. "The northern signal was sent yesterday. 11 other reserves are already moving." The committee chamber erupted. Eleanor opened Bellwether's rote ledger. Every convoy was headed toward a private warehouse at Blackwater Port, where ships would depart that evening. If the grain crossed the harbor, millions of pounds and thousands of winter lives would be lost. Julian looked at her. "What do we do?" Eleanor closed the ledger. "We make Parliament follow us to the docks." Royal officers reached Blackwater Port before sunset. 11 grain convoys stood beside 3 ships preparing to sail. Their sacks carried the marks of seized estates, while Bellwether's false manifest described them as private exports. Eleanor presented the route ledger to the harbor master. "Close the river." Chains rose across the harbor entrance, soldiers surrounded the warehouses, and every sack was counted before reporters and representatives of the robbed families. Inside Crane's office, investigators found the final evidence: letters between Crane, Vale, and Pembroke detailing the entire scheme. Vale had stolen an impression of the late Duke's seal while serving as his secretary. Years later, he used it to create false ancestral debts against strategically located estates. Crane seized the land, Pembroke falsified local accounts, and Bellwether prepared to remove the grain. Once winter prices rose, the company planned to buy thousands of ruined farms. Brackenmere had been their final obstacle because Eleanor's improvements controlled the central road, canal, and largest reserve. Within a month, Vale and Crane were convicted of fraud, conspiracy, arson, and attempting to manufacture a famine. Their assets were seized to repay the 12 estates. Hawkins confessed in exchange for a reduced sentence, while Pembroke was imprisoned after his payment records proved he had altered Eleanor's accounts for 3 years. Parliament publicly declared every accusation against Eleanor false. Brackenmere was restored to her under an independent settlement that Julian could never control. The eastern cottages remained permanently protected, and Eleanor was appointed chairwoman of a new northern grain trust. Julian received no appointment. Instead, he resigned his parliamentary influence and sold 2 Ashbourne properties to repay every pound Brackenmere had contributed toward his family's debts. Before Parliament, the tenants, and the press, he repeated his confession without blaming Crane. "I stripped my wife of authority, mocked the work that saved my estate, froze her money, and traded her inheritance for my ambition. I was deceived only because I preferred flattery to the truth she had already given me." Months later, he returned to Brackenmere alone. Eleanor stood beside the restored mill while workers installed its new wheel. Julian held the same iron key he had once given Crane. "This belongs to you," he said. She accepted it but did not invite him inside. "I do not expect forgiveness," he continued. "I have arranged a formal separation and transferred the remaining restitution into your trust. No condition requires you to return." Eleanor looked at the man she had once loved. His remorse was real, but it did not erase the moment he chose power over her dignity and the lives dependent upon her. "Perhaps one day we may speak without anger," she said. but my future will not be the reward for your regret." Julian bowed and left. At the estate gates, hundreds of tenants waited, not to block an invader this time, but to witness Eleanor reopen the road under her own authority. She placed the key into the lock. The gate swung wide,